Hi, everybody. Sorry for the late start. Had some issues getting the live stream going, so I apologize for that. I actually recorded some fascinating, riveting programming on the Zoom archive if you want to get into that. But you know what? Let's just go with this. So, tonight, we're going to look at a topic that sort of emerges as each day goes on about what's going to happen next. And sort of a little bit of background, if you're joining us for the first time, I wrote a book in 2008 called End of the Jews, Radical Breaks, Remakes, and What Comes Next, in which I sort of made the observation that 2008 be one of those points in Jewish history where the Jewish people are sort of confronting a crisis that will sort of force a radical break with the past and a remake. And to a certain extent, it did in many ways. But I think that 12 years later, we're facing an even bigger crisis that will force the Jewish community to make adjustments and make changes. Not just the Jewish community, I'm talking about the global community. But the emphasis or the focus of tonight's broadcast discussion is some phenomena that exist in the everyday, before COVID-19. People were doing this kind of stuff all the time anyway, these kind of psychological phenomena. And these concepts come to us from a field of research, a field of academia called behavioral economics. And let me get the screen sharing going here. So many exciting technological stuff happening tonight. So, as I was saying, behavioral economics is a recent addition to the field of academia. It's an interdisciplinary field. It kind of takes psychology and neuroscience and microeconomic theory and smushes them together in an attempt to sort of understand all the factors, the cognitive, psychological, emotional, cultural, and social factors that go into decision making. Because economists used to have a sense of like how people make decisions in the market, and it kind of shows as time went on that they were wrong, that people are not rational actors in many instances, and they make dumb decisions. In other words, people be crazy, and there are all kinds of quirks and phenomena that they've observed in the process of their research. And we're going to talk about 4 of them tonight, particularly the status quo bias. But here are 4 that I kind of want to introduce tonight. You probably may have experienced them yourself. The first one, actually may have experienced all of them. I do. I know I do. The first one's called status quo bias. And basically, the way to put it briefly or succinctly is that people like things to stay the same. And especially when they're faced with a decision that they kind of will be happy to not decide or to go with the way things were decided before. Inertia. Bodies at rest like to stay at rest. This could happen even when the cost of making the change or the transition is very low. And even if the importance of the decision is very great. Now I'm getting a message. Let's see if we got this up and going. Okay, so yes, we're going. This is great. People like to stick with decisions they made in the past because it's safe. It's a safe thing. Why rock the boat? If it worked before, let's just keep going with it. Especially if, and this is interesting, especially if there are lots of options. People will just rather say, you know what? Too many boxes of cereal on the shelf. I'm just going to go with the cornflakes. That's what I've always eaten. I'm just going to stick with it. This is related very closely to the sunk cost fallacy. Now, the sunk cost fallacy, basically, you say to yourself, I've invested so much already, I don't want to stop. And it's not just money, it could be time, it could be effort. So, for example, let's say you bought concert tickets. They were very expensive concert tickets, and the venue of the concert is an hour and a half, 2 hours away, and there's a snowstorm. Now, you could say to yourself, well, it's dangerous driving. I'm just going to stay home. But then you say, aha, I spent all this money on this ticket. I want to get my money's worth. And so you brave the snow and you brave, ending up in a ditch to go to this concert because you say, I've already invested $150 or whatever on this ticket and the Ticketmaster fees. I want to get my money's worth, or I want to get my time's worth or my effort's worth. The third concept comes to us from Kahneman and Tversky. These names may sound very familiar to you. These were Israeli economists. One's an economist, one's a psychologist, and they wrote a lot of books. I think it was Blink was one of them. They made a lot of they wrote a lot of books that made it to the New York Times bestseller list. And the way they explain loss aversion is that I feel the loss more than the gain. It looms larger in my mind. I would rather avoid the pain of losing. I would rather take a risk to avoid pain because that pain I feel or I think will be greater than the joy I will experience in gaining. Okay, let me say that again. That I'm willing to take a risk to avoid a loss rather than make a gain. The third one is the last one is the endowment effect. Now, this one basically can be summed up in that it's mine, and if it's mine, it's better and it has more value. That I put a greater value on things that I own rather than things that are not mine, even if they're worth objectively less. And in fact, you can say the IKEA business model is based on it because they not only get you to buy the stuff, they get you to put it together. So it's there's like a double endowment effect. You feel this is my Billy bookcase and I own it and I have, it's part of my life and my collection and I built it. So if I'm going to put it up on Craigslist, clearly the value is higher than what it should be. Now, the most famous, I guess, pop culture practitioner of the endowment effect is our friend Gollum over here, that clearly overvalued the One Ring, even though it destroyed him. It gave him long life, but it corroded his soul and corrupted him completely. Now, these four phenomena are at play in the best of times. But, as our society emerges out from under this pandemic, people will strive to restore what happened before, the status quo ante, as quickly as possible. However, what we're going to talk about tonight are some examples or some sort of, processes that have been started or processes already at work that you can't put back, you can't reverse. And you can use whatever metaphor you like, putting the toothpaste back in the tube, putting the genie back in the bottle. My favorite is you can't unring that bell. And the first one that I want to talk about is going to involve politics. And again, wherever you may stand on the political spectrum and whether you agree or disagree, these are things that are happening, and you can't spin them every which way. The first one, and the most, I guess, the pressing one is that the three Western states of the United States are making sounds of not going their own way, but doing their own thing. Gavin Newsom, as you can see the date on that headline there, is from April 9th. He is referring to California as a nation state, which is, shall we say, somewhat more, I'm not going to say it has more of a super state status, but a nation state, you often think of independent nation state. So is he saying that California is seceding from the United States? No, that's not what he's saying. But what he's saying is that they are no longer going to look to Washington for guidance or for leadership or for policy. And this was further, shall we say, grounded in reality when on April 13th, Washington, Oregon, and California sort of announced a Western States Pact, and where the three states together are going to coordinate the restarting of their economies and how they're going to deal with COVID-19. Not to be undone, a similar coalition, the Eastern Coalition, has also been created between the states of New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, Pennsylvania, Rhode Island, and Delaware. They are also going to coordinate their actions around restarting their economy and dealing with COVID-19. And, quote, they're going to let science, not politics, determine when to lift social and business restrictions. So, in a way, they're kind of like workers unionizing at a factory to say, we are going to get together and make decisions for ourselves because clearly management doesn't know what they're doing. The next one is going to get into a little class-based analysis, and I do apologize in advance for those of us that are not fans of Marx or Marxist analysis. But in the years leading up to COVID-19, say the last 20 years, you can go back into the last 30 years, globalization has brought the planet together and has sort of interweaved the economies and the markets of countries to the point where there's basically almost like one giant market. And in this giant market, capital moved freely, products moved freely, labor moved freely, information moved freely. Even in like with China, like despite their attempts to be to sort of clamp down on their population, ideas, information. They banned Winnie the Pooh because of all the because they made fun of Xi Jinping about it. Now, and our stores in the developed world are filled with products from China, from Indonesia, from Thailand. This is a boon to consumers, I suppose. But with declining wages, will folks have the money to buy this stuff? And what about the costs of this stuff on the climate? That's a separate issue. But what we've also seen as a result of globalization and trade deals and such is that manufacturing jobs, the factories that used to sort of be the anchor of the town that gave everyone the jobs, went away, right? A lot of those jobs would have gone away anyway to computerization and robotics, but a lot of them went away to countries where labor was cheaper, where the terms for corporations were better, leaving the communities back in the developed world to sort of get hollowed out. Whole regions of the industrialized world were hollowed out, polarizing politics, fueling xenophobia. Frederick Jameson famously said that it's easier to imagine the end of the world before you can imagine the end of capitalism. And we're, with this pandemic and Hollywood movies, we're sort of confronted with imagining what the world might, ending would look like. But instead, we might be seeing what Jameson kind of talked about is that we may be seeing the end of capitalism. Now, even though capitalism may not end up in the dustbin of history as a result of this experience, we're seeing its seams. We're seeing how the wear and tear on that system, especially in the United States. And all the fringe arguments around how the economic system has to be dismantled or scrutinized anew are being heard. You're hearing this kind of comments not from these radical lefties. Demands for universal health care, around COVID are coming from all sectors of the American political system. And not to mention the fact that universal basic income, which used to be a fringe thing from Andrew Yang and various libertarians and economists. Now, the Pope is calling for it. And you could say, well, the Pope is kind of a hippie and, he embraces all kinds of weirdo progressive ideas. But here in Canada, the Canadian government rolled out a UBI type program in a matter of days. They announced it on April 6th. They opened up the website, and depending on what month of the year you're born is the day you're supposed to apply. And within 48 to 72 hours, the money appeared in your account. Other EU countries have talked about this. Spain has mentioned that they're going to continue with the UBI program even after the pandemic ends. So, like I said, this is a bell that once it's rung, it can't be unrung. Here's another example of how free market capitalism is going to be challenged or deglobalized. The Japanese government, as part of its bailout, is basically paying Japanese firms to come back home to Japan. Japanese industries at this time were struggling to get raw materials and components for their manufacturing, for their businesses, and because the factories in China were inaccessible. They were closed for much of the first quarter of 2020. So this showed what they call a lack of resilience in the economy and in businesses. And so basically businesses are starting to say, well, how are all these essential products we need moving around the world? And if they're moving from someplace far away from China to us, maybe they shouldn't anymore. Maybe we should bring these industries back home. Maybe we should take those factories that we sent to China and bring them back to the homeland because we're going to need them. If this ever happens again and China is shut down, we're going to be stuck. They're not alone in talking about this. Other countries are starting to make these kinds of noises that they may bring their manufacturing back from China, from wherever. And this obviously is not sitting well with China because they benefit from this arrangement and from this relationship with the developed world. Now, the only other real precedent we have from history for something like a global pandemic is the Black Death and the bubonic plague. And before it decimated medieval Europe was a feudal system. And this goes back to like middle school, history class. But feudalism basically was organized kind of like in a very hierarchical triangle. There was the king and nobility on top. They held the land. The nobility held the land for the king, and basically, in exchange for the nobility would have the lands from the king in exchange for providing military service to the king. It's all kind of like a quid pro quo arrangement. The vassals were tenants of the nobles, and then underneath the vassals were the peasants, and the peasants would give their lord, whose land they worked, their labor and a share of the produce in exchange for protection. So basically, you had kind of like, servitude for most of the population. At the level above, they were also kind of in service to their betters in a different way. Now, once the outbreaks of bubonic plague petered out in the 1350s, and the millions of dead were either buried or whatever they did with the dead, there was a labor shortage. And serfs that had once been tied to a particular piece of land now had a choice who they would work for. Lords could not just as a matter of course assume that laborers would work under the conditions before. And they had to make conditions better, and they had to make the conditions more attractive to attract the workers. Otherwise, excuse me, their land would be untended. And so they had to increase wages. They had to increase benefits across the board. And when the lords kind of got things going again, and the money started to flow again, they figured, well, why? Those increases and those benefits were temporary, right? I mean, it was because it was after the plague and we needed them. But now that things are back to normal, let's take that stuff away. Well, they tried that, and there were a series of peasant revolts across Europe. So what's the equivalent today? Like, is there a lesson to be learned from that today? Well, absolutely there is, because there's, this whole category of essential worker that, we hear about when we used to think about what the essential worker is. And we thought about, oh, maybe it's, the firefighter, maybe it's the police officer, maybe it's the guy or the gal or non-binary pal climbing up on the pole to fix the wiring for the electrical grid. But the reality is, it's not just them. It's the delivery people who are bringing packages to us from Amazon. It's the guys and gals and non-binary pals working in the Amazon factories and the Amazon warehouses, pulling stuff off shelves and putting them in boxes for us. It's the people who are working at Instacart or DoorDash who are bringing us groceries to our homes. And they're risking their lives for us, for some cases, minimum wage or tips. It's the janitorial staff. It's the messengers again. And how the current market can think that they're going to just pay these folks what they always paid them and not have anything change, that's a system that's not going to continue, without any disruption. The seams are showing, and you can see here already. Here's one example. Warehouse workers are forcing Amazon to take COVID-19 seriously. And this is just the beginning. When these guys organize into, striking, then we're really going to feel it. And it's at this point, we need them more than they need us. And once this kind of collective action happens, it's going to redefine the relationship between labor and management. Another bell that can't be unrung is this question about you can't work from home. I'm sure that we've all heard this numerous times from various, business world pundits and bosses, et cetera, that working from home is impossible. Folks had to commute during rush hour and come in every day. But it turns out that apparently it was always a possibility. And it would have had tremendous benefits for the workers. It would have had a reduction in congestion, stress on public transportation networks, carbon emissions. There'd be all kinds of benefits that we could have had if people had worked from home. And in fact, it's interesting, a point that Bill Gates makes here in this interview, that coronavirus will alter work forever, but not school. We'll get to that later. But basically, all these tech firms were already kind of making noises about how, having these massive buildings with offices in the most expensive cities on the planet was just unsustainable. Why can't they work from home? But Add to this the fact that, for example, China and Singapore, who are kind of restarting their economies already, they are letting people go back to work, but there are restrictions and new patterns for work in place. So, for example, they're thinking of setting up a system of A days and B days, where people will go into some professions will go to work into the office on A days and stay home on B days, and vice versa. This is already in motion. This is not going to get put back in the tube of toothpaste when it's done. And people may not only sort of become acclimated to this, but may also come to like it. I mean, I know from my experience that if I have to sit through one more Zoom session, I don't know what I'm going to do. But the fact is, in shall we say, smaller doses, it's great. I don't have to wear pants. You know what I mean? Like, this is a great thing. Another potential change going forward is the change in use and future allocation of space as a result of the shift to work from home, as a result of physical distancing. On the macro level, we're going to see, friends and families are going to still go on planes to see each other, but businesses won't be sending people to travel. We saw sort of a small example of this after 9/11 when, people were skittish about getting on airplanes for other reasons. But on the micro level, people may just not want to go places where there are lots of people until we're all confident that this COVID-19 thing is not going to recur. Maybe after a vaccine, we'll feel differently. But until then, we're not going to go congregate on Main Street anymore. We can order in. This will have a tremendous impact, obviously, on small and local businesses designed on the old model. They may have to pivot and reconceive of how they do things. I mean, we saw it already with all the delivery apps that you'd go into a restaurant and the kitchen would be working, at a frenetic pace. And there's maybe 4 people in the whole restaurant because most of the food they're making is going out the door. It's not going to the people in the business itself. So that's what's happening now. You're seeing places that, are converting into sort of moving out of the restaurant space into a more industrial kitchen space and producing food and having it just shipped off to people's homes. But on the individual level, what we're seeing now is that people are walking more. People are bicycling place to place. Are they going to come back to buses and subways? Or are they going to, are those things going to have to be redesigned for physical distancing? And will COVID-19 kill ride sharing? Not the Uber, the Uber that you share with other people. Is that going to go away as well? We'll see. We're also seeing changes in interior design. One of the hardest hit communities from COVID-19 is the elderly. And there are outbreaks in various nursing facilities. And what nursing facility designers are starting to realize is that they cannot use the kind of dormitory model anymore for design as efficient and as cost effective as it is. They may have to shift, and some of them already have, from their designs and future designs, moving to like a neighborhood model where you can have like a neighborhood where the residents live and they socialize with each other and they dine together in small groups. And they're kind of like, like what we're setting up for ourselves, these little pods that we have where it's just, we are the people in our pod and we don't see anybody outside of our pod. And if there's a case of, we have to sort of lock it down, we can lock down our pod and then everyone else can go on with their business. And you can see here an example of a village design of it for a nursing facility. We might see new homes designed on this way, where in the vestibule when you come in, much like you do when you come in or exit a Jewish cemetery, that there's a space for you to wash your hands. That's definitely in the cards, and we'll definitely probably see a resurgence of Netilat Yadayim, ritual hand washing, as a commandment we teach kids across the denominational spectrum. Usually that was a thing reserved for more traditional denominations. And as you got into the more liberal denominations, it was kind of a thing we would do or talk about, but we may actually get into it in a pretty serious way. The handshake is probably going to go away too. And yes, it's been with us for a long time. The status quo in this one is very deep. We have archaeological ruins and ancient texts that show handshaking going back as far as the 5th century BCE. A gesture of peace, like, what do you have in your hand? Do you have a weapon? No, shake my hand. Let's prove it. You do it when you meet. You do it when we know. We've done handshaking, right? We've done it for forever. We teach our kids, when you shake someone's hand, look them in the eye, shake firmly. Don't, turn the hand upside down to dominate, There's all kinds of mores and sort of things we teach our children about this, but it also spreads pathogens. And so much so that Dr. Fauci says he'd like to see it stop, even when this pandemic ends, that we should just do away with it and think of something else. It's just bad. It's not a good tradition to have. And, we shouldn't do it just because we've always done it that way, because it's a bad thing to do. So let's get rid of that. We have already some changes afoot in worship. For example, in Kuwait, the muezzins in their call to prayer, in the adhan, the call to prayer, they changed the language from hasten to prayer to pray in your homes. This is just one small change. But here you have an example. I don't know if you can see the image of Kohanim, the priests at the Western Wall on Passover, standing 2 meters apart, all with face masks, to provide the priestly benediction, the Birkat Kohanim. And you could see the guy there in the middle, not wearing a talit. He's the cameraman, because they were live. They were casting it, live streaming it so everyone could see it. This is the future, right? If we can't get into prayer spaces the way we did before, or we're always going to be worried that if we get too many people in the same space, it's going to violate some code or the cops are going to bust in, we're going to move to this kind of ad hoc solution becoming more permanent. The Zoom bar mitzvahs, the Zoom Satyrs, they're the norm in liberal denominations. And we talked last week about how there was an attempt to sort of kind of go through the back door in the more traditional denominations. And in fact, I would argue that they're already in the back door. They just don't want to talk about it. Will this continue after the quarantine is over, after this pandemic is declared defeated? Now, the thing is, we had a similar moment in Jewish history before, when there was this very strong temptation or status quo bias to go back to the way it was before. 6th century BCE, the first temple was destroyed by the Babylonians, and the vast majority of Jews were taken into exile. During the 2 generations, they were there for about 40 or so years. They didn't just sit on their hands and wait to go back to the land of Israel. I mean, yes, the prophets talked about it. They prophesied about it. They waxed and they rhapsodized about it. But there's no guarantee that was going to happen. And Jews had to get on with their Jewish lives. I mean, again, they could have been game over at that point. But they changed. They evolved. They adopted new practices. Rather than near offering korbanot, sacrifices in the temple, they would create kind of this mix of sing-song sessions with the Psalms and reading and interpreting the Torah. Miniature temples, where we would call today synagogues, where Jews would gather, sing, and study. When Cyrus the Great of Persia conquers Babylonia in 539, he encourages the Jews to go back to their home and rebuild the temple. But when they got there, they were faced with a very interesting dilemma. What do you do about the singing and reading Torah part? Because we could just restart the sacrifices, right? Rebuild the temple, which they did. Get the Kohanim, the priests, back in there. Get them, washing their hands, whatever, doing what they need to do. Get the altars built, bring the animals, start sacrificing again. No problem. What do you do about those gatherings where they sang and studied Torah? Well, they kept both. And I wouldn't be surprised if, after this pandemic is over, many Jewish congregations, especially those that never had, an elaborate synagogue building to begin with, will either remain online, or, if they can afford it, do both. And the thing is, we've already had synagogues that have done this, that have had services in the main sanctuary and then live stream them for the folks at home. So again, not a huge departure from what they've done already, but now the kind of fringe, only the shut-ins and the weirdos stay at home and watch on the computer. We've all done it, right? We're all doing it. It's normal now. But the question I have, the question I wonder about is how many of these congregations will be able to pull it off, considering the economic turmoil that's to follow the pandemic, right? If people have lost their work and they can't pay their dues, which is the primary way that synagogues, pay the bills and keep the lights on and pay their professionals, who's going to be able to afford the dues? Who's going to be able to pay the rent, et cetera, et cetera. We may find that more and more congregations are migrating online out of necessity and not out of choice. Now, next week, we're going to look more closely at the changes afoot in education in the classroom. We may tend to think that what is happening with our kids in their school classrooms is e-learning, online learning, distance learning. It's safe to say that what they're doing is definitely distance learning, but in the time of crisis, and the army of teachers out there who managed this transition from face-to-face to online did it. They're heroes for doing it, but they're effectively working on the car while the car is in motion and driving on the expressway at 60 miles an hour, and they're just trying to hold on for dear life at this point. And then I don't think they're going to get a break either, because while they're at home trying to convert face-to-face curricula to online curricula, they also have their kids underfoot and their spouses and food to prepare and laundry to do, etc. Like, the domestic life continues, and there's no break from that at all. So next session, we're going to look at the changes afoot in education. And as we saw at the earlier point in this discussion, when Bill Gates said that work has irrevocably changed, but we still have to have face-to-face for schools, I completely agree. But again, this bell has been rung. We can use this technology to teach. We're just not doing it to the fullest extent that it can be used. I mean, I think teachers are figuring it out slowly as we go, and they're playing around with the various platforms and doing all kinds of interesting things. But right now, we're still in the kind of crisis mode, and we're still trying to figure it out. But eventually, and we'll talk more about this next time, what we can do with the technology, we're sort of just scratching the surface on that. And my hope is that as we go forward and the pandemic is defeated, and we go back to being able to be out in public and in groups of 50 or more, that hopefully the lessons we've learned in the classroom will continue. And I guess we'll talk more about that next week. Thank you for joining, and I apologize for the glitch in the live stream. Those of you that are observing 7 days of Passover, enjoy your bread. For those of you observing 8, one more day to go. Keep going. You're almost there. And I will see you next week. If you have any questions or comments for me, by the way, you can reach out to me at Dr. Dan, DRDAN, at adraba.ca. That's ADRABA.ca. Otherwise, I got some nice comments from folks since the last session, and I look forward to more. So thank you.